3 years. That's how long it took to destroy a civilization that had stood for 25,000. 3 years of war, billions dead, thousands of worlds burned. An entire order of guardians wiped out in a single night by the soldiers they had trusted with their lives. Not one moment of it was an accident. Every battle, every alliance, every desperate choice made by generals and senators and Jedi who believed they were fighting to protect the galaxy, all of it had been designed in advance, arranged, set in motion by a single man sitting quietly at the very center of power, pulling strings that no one could see, toward an ending none of them could imagine until it was already done. One man understood this better than anyone else in the galaxy. His name, publicly, was Palpatine, Senator from Naboo, later Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, a patient man with kind eyes and a warm voice, and an ability to make anyone who sat across from him feel like they were the most important person in the room. He had been planning the fall of the Republic for decades. He had been a Sith Lord his entire political career, hiding behind the face of a dedicated public servant, climbing the ranks of galactic government with a methodical precision that even his former master would have admired. His master was dead. Palpatine had seen to that. Now he worked alone, moving pieces across a board so vast that no one else could see its full shape. He was not impatient. He had never been impatient. The plan had taken decades to construct and would take a few more years yet to complete. And he was completely comfortable with that. The most dangerous things in the galaxy were always comfortable with waiting. The first visible piece of his design had already moved years earlier. His apprentice, a man once known as Count Dooku, had walked away from the Jedi Order and disappeared into the shadows. Dooku was not a fool. He was, in fact, one of the most brilliant and dangerous men alive. A former Jedi Master, once considered among the most gifted swordsmen in the Order's history. He had studied under Master Yoda himself. He had trained Qui-Gon Jinn. He had spent decades serving the Republic as a Jedi, watching the Senate grow more corrupt with each passing session, watching the gap between the ideals of the Republic and the reality of its governance widen every year into something that could no longer be politely ignored or attributed to the normal inefficiency of complex institutions. When he finally left the Order, it was not out of weakness or cowardice or wounded pride. It was out of a kind of bitter clarity. The system was broken, he believed, and no one inside it had the will or the capacity to fix it. What Dooku didn't fully understand was that the man who had recruited him to the Sith cause was the very source of much of that corruption. Palpatine had been engineering the Republic's decay from inside its own institutions for his entire career. Dooku believed he was serving a vision of a better galaxy, that the destruction of the old Republic would allow something stronger to rise from the wreckage. He would be the visible face of the coming storm, the public villain, the man who gave the growing discontent in the Outer Rim a name and a direction, and eventually, an army. The separatist movement did not begin as a conspiracy. That is the part most histories, written after the fact by people looking for a single cause and a single moment, get wrong. It began as something real. Thousands of star systems, mostly in the Outer Rim, had spent generations feeling ignored by the Coruscant-centered government. Trade routes that benefited the core worlds were protected and maintained at Republic expense. Trade routes that served the Outer Rim were left to the mercy of pirates and criminal syndicates who filled whatever vacuum the Republic declined to occupy. Republic infrastructure and services stopped at convenient borders that happened to exclude the poorer and more distant systems. Taxation policies written by senators from wealthy worlds crushed struggling planets whose own senators lacked the seniority or the allies to push back effectively. The frustration was genuine. The grievances were real. And for generations, those grievances had produced petitions and committee hearings and proposed amendments, and none of the actual change that would have addressed the underlying problems. The Senate was very good at talking about problems. It was considerably less effective at resolving them. Dooku gave those grievances a leader and a movement. He traveled from system to system, meeting with planetary governors, corporate executives, military commanders, anyone who felt the Republic had failed them, or who could be convinced that it had. He was persuasive in a way that few people ever manage, not through passion or theatrical rhetoric, but through precision. He laid out arguments with the calm authority of a man who had spent his life studying power in all its forms and had concluded, after considerable reflection, that clarity was the most effective tool available. System after system signed on. Guilds and corporations that had long chafed under Republic regulations and tariff structures saw an opportunity that aligned neatly with their existing interests. The Trade Federation, the Techno Union, the Banking Clan, the Commerce Guild. One by one, and then in clusters, they pledged their private armies and their considerable financial resources to Dooku's confederacy of independent systems. By the time the Senate fully understood what was happening, the Confederacy controlled thousands of worlds and had assembled a military force larger than anything the Republic had faced in recent memory. And the Republic, for all its ancient traditions and vast territory, had almost no army of its own. The Jedi had served as peacekeepers for 1,000 years, resolving disputes through diplomacy and targeted intervention. They were not a military force in any meaningful sense. They were roughly 10,000 warriors scattered across the galaxy on individual missions, none of which were designed around conventional warfare. The Republic's defense had always depended on member worlds contributing their own forces when crisis demanded. But this crisis was moving faster than that old system could respond to. And everyone in a position to know this was aware of it, and no one could agree on what to do about it without creating the very conflict they were trying to avoid. The Senate debated. It argued. It filibustered and formed committees and tabled proposals and brought them back up and tabled them again. Some senators argued for creating a formal Republic army immediately. Others argued that militarization would appear aggressive to wavering neutral systems and push more of them toward the Confederacy. The debate dragged on for months while out in the galaxy. The Confederacy kept growing, and Dooku kept recruiting, and the droid production lines kept running. And in the shadows of the Chancellor's office, Palpatine watched and waited, and occasionally whispered the right words into the right ears at the right moments, carefully positioned as the reasonable voice of moderation, while every day brought the crisis he was engineering one step closer to the moment when it would be undeniable. The attack on Senator Padme Amidala was the moment that changed the calculus entirely. Padme had been one of the most vocal opponents of the Military Creation Act, the legislation that would have formalized the Republic Army everyone was arguing about. She had served as Queen of Naboo a decade earlier, had faced the Trade Federation's invasion of her world as a teenager with the resources of a small planet and the determination of someone who refused to believe that the worst outcome was inevitable. She had come to the Senate with a fierce and genuine commitment to resolving conflict through means other than organized violence. She believed the Republic could be reformed without war. She believed that a military buildup would make conflict more likely, not less, by reducing the diplomatic incentives on both sides to find alternatives. She was arguing her position to anyone who would listen. Someone decided she needed to stop arguing it permanently. The Jedi Council assigned protection. 2 Jedi specifically, Obi-Wan Kenobi and his Padawan, Anakin Skywalker. Obi-Wan was exactly the kind of Jedi the Council trusted with sensitive assignments requiring both skill and judgment. Calm, methodical, disciplined, deeply committed to the Order's code and to the expectations that code created. He had been training Anakin for 10 years, and their relationship was complicated in the way that relationships between strong-willed teachers and even stronger-willed students always tend to be. They respected each other profoundly. They frustrated each other constantly. Anakin was brilliant and powerful and entirely incapable of operating within the careful boundaries that Obi-Wan believed a Jedi had to respect, not just for the sake of the code, but for the sake of the Jedi's own stability. Obi-Wan was wise and measured and occasionally incapable of acknowledging that Anakin's instincts, even when undisciplined, were often exactly right in ways that careful analysis would eventually confirm too late to act on. Anakin had grown up on Tatooine as a slave. He had been discovered by Qui-Gon Jinn at age 9 and brought into the Jedi Order later than was standard, which meant he carried with him memories and emotional connections that most Jedi younglings never had the chance to form. His mother was still alive on Tatooine when he left. He thought about her more than he told anyone. He thought about Padme even more than that. He had met her as a boy during the Naboo crisis and had carried something for her ever since. Something he had told himself for 10 years was just admiration, just the harmless feelings of a child who had met someone extraordinary. He was 20 years old now, and those feelings were not harmless and they were not childish. And some part of him had known this for a long time, without being willing to acknowledge it directly. When the assassination attempts brought them back together, neither of them pretended that the years had left things between them unchanged. The Council sent Anakin to escort Padme to Naboo for her safety, while Obi-Wan followed the trail of whoever had sent the killers. 2 missions running in parallel. Obi-Wan's would lead him toward a truth that none of the Republic knew existed. Anakin's would lead him toward the one person in the galaxy he should not have been falling in love with, and would not stop himself from falling in love with regardless. Obi-Wan tracked the evidence to a water world called Kamino, far off the standard star charts, and, he discovered, deliberately removed from the Jedi archives. The deletion was professional. Whoever had done it had known what they were doing and had access to systems that should not have been accessible from outside the temple. What Obi-Wan found on Kamino was something no one in the Republic knew anything about. A clone army, millions of soldiers, all grown from the same genetic template, all created and trained for a single purpose: to fight for the Republic. A Jedi named Sifo Dyas had placed the order years earlier, the Kaminoan scientists explained. The Republic Senate had authorized it. Obi-Wan knew nothing about any of this, because none of it was true. Sifo Dyas was dead. He had been killed years before, shortly after reportedly experiencing visions of a great conflict approaching the galaxy. Someone had used his name to commission the army and then erased all record of both Kamino and the commission from the places where people would have looked for them, and had waited for the right moment to reveal it. The genetic template for the army was a bounty hunter named Jango Fett. Obi-Wan met him in a sparse apartment on one of the cloning platforms. A quiet and deliberately dangerous man who wore Mandalorian armor and kept his own counsel and lived in those spare rooms with a young boy named Boba, his son, cloned for him as a separate personal arrangement, unaltered, raised as a child rather than a soldier. Jango was professional in the way that truly lethal people are. Without any performance of threat, just a steady economy of movement and attention that made clear he was aware of every exit and every angle at all times without appearing to look at any of them. He told Obi-Wan almost nothing useful and then tried to kill him when he decided Obi-Wan was asking too many of the right questions. The chase that followed moved from the rain-soaked platforms of Kamino through an asteroid field to a red desert world called Geonosis. Obi-Wan followed Jango's ship, nearly died in the asteroids, and arrived to find something far larger than one bounty hunter. The Separatist leadership was gathered there in the tunnels beneath the planet's surface. Count Dooku was there. The armies of the Confederacy were being assembled in the foundry complexes that the insectoid Geonosians had built and were now running at full capacity for whoever paid adequately. Battle droids were rolling off production lines by the millions. The war that the Senate was still arguing about how to prevent had already been manufactured. It was waiting for a signal that someone was going to give it regardless of what the Senate decided. Obi-Wan transmitted his findings before he was captured. His message reached Anakin and Padme on Naboo, and then, relayed further, reached the Jedi Council and the Senate on Coruscant. The signal was incomplete, breaking up under planetary interference. But the essentials were there. The Senate, faced with a Jedi prisoner in Separatist custody and a massive army being assembled in secret, finally did what it had been debating for months. It granted Chancellor Palpatine emergency powers to respond. And Palpatine, who had been waiting for exactly this, with exactly this patience, used those powers to authorize the use of the clone army. The army whose existence no one had voted for. The army that had been secretly built while the Senate was still arguing about whether building an army was a good idea. The Jedi Council accepted the situation because accepting it was the only alternative to watching Obi-Wan die on Geonosis and the Confederacy grow unchallenged while the Republic remained defenseless. Master Yoda traveled to Kamino personally and prepared the first wave for deployment. 200,000 units ready immediately, with millions more in various stages of development. The Republic had a military for the first time in 1,000 years, built without debate, deployed before anyone had fully examined what they were deploying, or asked where it had really come from, or whose purposes it was ultimately going to serve. Anakin and Padme did not wait for the rescue mission. They went to Geonosis themselves, were captured themselves, and ended up in an arena alongside Obi-Wan facing public execution by arena creatures, while the Separatist leadership watched from the gallery above. The Geonosians were a species with theatrical instincts, and the execution was designed as a statement. 3 important enemies of the Confederacy killed publicly. A message to the Republic and to neutral systems watching that the age of Jedi walking into any situation and walking back out through reputation alone was finished. The creatures were enormous. A reek, broad and armored, enraged by captivity and pain into something purely reactive, an Acklay, multi-limbed and moving with terrible speed, driven by something between hunger and aggression that had been sharpened by captivity into focus. A Nexu, sleek and clawed, and faster than something that size had any business being. Obi-Wan was chained to a pillar. Anakin was chained. Padme had already partially freed herself, because Padme Amidala was not someone who waited to be rescued. She had trained in survival since her years as a palace guard decoy for the Queen of Naboo. She was not a combatant in the Jedi sense, but she was capable and fierce and absolutely unwilling to die in a Geonosian arena without making it as difficult as possible for the people who had put her there. The fight was desperate and improvised, and alive in the way that pure survival is. Obi-Wan using his chains as a weapon, Anakin doing things with the Force under extreme duress that training had never quite produced. Padme climbing. She always climbed, always found the angle that other people missed because they were too focused on the obvious threat directly in front of them. The Geonosians expected 3 helpless prisoners. They got 3 people who were going to die before they stopped moving. Then Mace Windu walked into the viewing balcony and placed a purple blade against Jango Fett's throat. Below in the arena, 100 Jedi ignited their lightsabers from every entrance simultaneously. Purple and blue and green moving through the arena floor with the purposeful speed of people who had been waiting for exactly this signal. Jedi fought battle droids. Droids poured in from every opening in numbers that kept climbing. Jango Fett went for Mace Windu and lost, and his son Boba watched from the stands with an expression that would spend years hardening into something Geonosis had permanently shaped. The battle droids kept coming. Jedi started falling. The numbers were simply wrong. Even 100 Jedi could not hold indefinitely against waves of droids pouring from facilities built at industrial scale for exactly this purpose. Then the gunships came. Clone troopers descended from the sky in LAT gunships. White armor reflecting the red Geonosian sunlight, moving with the precision that years on Kamino had built into them. Master Yoda had brought the first wave of the Grand Army of the Republic, and those soldiers moved through the arena and onto the plains outside with an efficiency that was striking in its completeness. The battle on the plains was the first real engagement of the Clone Wars, and it was massive. Hundreds of thousands of droids against the first deployed clones, gunships strafing droid lines, artillery walking its fire across the red earth, Jedi generals directing clone formations into positions that Force-enhanced battlefield awareness identified faster than any conventional command structure could have managed. The Force was not quiet in a place where so many beings were dying in so short a time. Anakin lost his arm in the fighting. A duel with Dooku, which neither sought but neither avoided, ended with his right arm removed below the elbow. He received a mechanical replacement within days, the prosthetic nerve connections forming until the sensation returned almost completely. He was 20 years old and already carrying the first permanent mark of what the war would cost him. Dooku escaped. That was the outcome that mattered most strategically. The leader of the Confederacy slipped away in his solar sailor while the battle was still resolving, flew to Coruscant, met his master in the shadowed corridor of an industrial district, and received congratulations on a job precisely executed. The war had begun exactly as planned. The wedding on Naboo was small. No guests. No ceremony in any formal sense. Just Anakin and Padme on a terrace in the Lake Country with the evening coming in gold across the water and 2 droids who were the only witnesses to something that could not be taken back. They had both known it was coming. There are things stronger than codes and complications and all the rational arguments for why something is a terrible idea. They had tried the arguments. The arguments had lost. Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala were married in secret, and the war they were both about to disappear into had barely begun. Music. The Clone Wars did not start with a strategy. That came later. What came first was everywhere at once. A galaxy-wide storm of simultaneous crises, leaving the Republic scrambling to respond on a dozen fronts, while the Confederacy kept opening new ones. Count Dooku had spent years preparing. He knew where the Republic was weakest. He knew which systems were uncertain in their loyalties. He knew which supply lines, if disrupted, would hurt the most. The separatist military machine, powered by the combined industrial capacity of the Trade Federation and the Techno-Union, and all the corporations that had pledged to the cause, could flood a theater of war with battle droids faster than the Republic could replace clone casualties. Droids were cheap. Droids could be produced in days. Clones took years and enormous ongoing resources. The mathematics of attrition favored the Confederacy, and everyone doing the strategic calculations on both sides understood this perfectly well. The Jedi became generals. That was the solution the Republic arrived at, because what other option was there? They had the clones and they had the Jedi, and they needed to use both as effectively as possible. But Jedi had never been soldiers. They had been peacekeepers and diplomats and individual warriors for 1,000 years. The idea of one Jedi commanding thousands of soldiers, of making the large-scale tactical decisions that sustained military campaigns required, of accepting troop casualties as a variable in a strategic equation, none of that was what any of them had trained for. Some Jedi adapted quickly. Their force-enhanced perception of the battlefield gave them advantages no conventional military academy could teach. Others struggled with the weight of what they were being asked to become. The war changed all of them, even the ones who never acknowledged it was happening. The campaigns in the early months spread across the Outer Rim simultaneously. More fronts opening faster than the Republic could fully respond to any single one of them. Christophsis was among the first major sustained engagements. A crystal world valuable for its resources and its position along key hyperspace routes. Separatist forces had landed in significant numbers and were fortifying against counterattack. When Obi-Wan and Anakin arrived with a Republic fleet to address the situation, what they found was a military picture already complicated by betrayal. Someone inside the Republic chain of command had been feeding information to the Confederacy. Troops were getting hit too precisely in places they should have been safe. The treachery was identified and dealt with, but the damage had already accumulated, and the awareness that it could happen again, anywhere, in any unit, added a layer of uncertainty to every subsequent Republic operation for the rest of the war. Christophsis also gave Anakin something he had not requested and was not sure he was ready for. A young Togruta girl named Ahsoka Tano arrived unannounced and introduced herself as his new Padawan learner. Anakin had not asked for a Padawan. He was not convinced he was equipped to train anyone. He had enough difficulty managing his own relationship with the Jedi Code without carrying responsibility for someone else's formation within it. Ahsoka was 14 years old and completely certain of her own ability in the particular way that teenagers who are genuinely quite good at something can be before experience has had enough time to build appropriate doubt into their foundations. She called him Sky Guy almost immediately. He called her Snips. The nicknames were the visible surface of something more real that was forming underneath the friction of those first days. Yoda had assigned her to Anakin deliberately. The reasoning, which Obi-Wan understood and appreciated even when it made him quietly amused, was that teaching someone else would require Anakin to articulate and embody the things he most consistently ignored in his own conduct. You cannot tell a student to be patient while you are personally charging past every plan. You cannot tell a student to trust their master while you yourself are constantly second-guessing yours. Ahsoka was meant to be a mirror as much as a student. She was also, as quickly became apparent, extraordinarily talented. She moved through a fight in a way that was instinctive and aggressive and full of forward momentum, and that matched Anakin's own approach better than most Jedi she might have been assigned to. They were, in spite of all the obvious complications, well matched in the ways that mattered most when lives were on the line. Working alongside them throughout Christophsis and in the campaigns that followed was Captain Rex, commander of the 501st Legion, a clone trooper who had been built in a facility on a water world and given a numerical designation and a genetic template, and who had turned all of that into a person through the particular process that experience and choice make available to anyone willing to use them. Rex was practical and direct and deeply committed to the men under his command in a way that went well past military loyalty into something that looked, if you looked at it honestly, like love for his brothers. He and Anakin understood each other with the efficiency of people who share a particular fundamental orientation toward the world, both inclined toward action over deliberation, both with a talent for finding the move that wasn't supposed to be available. Rex also had a quality that Anakin found easier to work with than most of the people around him. He wanted what he wanted directly, and he said so. When he had concerns about a plan, he raised them. When he disagreed with an order, he stated his position clearly, and then, if overruled by better reasoning, he executed the order fully and without resentment. That clarity was restful in its way. For someone who spent as much time as Anakin did navigating the layered indirectness of Jedi politics and Senate relationships and a marriage he couldn't discuss with anyone, their first real test together on Christophsis produced the pattern that would define the 501st's approach to war throughout the years that followed. The Separatist commander had a deflector shield generator that made orbital support useless and ground assault nearly impossible while it was operational. Anakin's solution was to go through the center of the problem rather than around it. He and Ahsoka used a stolen shuttle and considerable improvisation to penetrate the shield perimeter from the inside, reach the generator, and destroy it from a position the Separatists had not thought to guard, because reaching it should have been impossible by any conventional analysis. The kind of plan that looks like pure recklessness until it works, and then gets called genius by everyone who doubted it. Christophsis fell. The Republic held it and moved to the next engagement. The Malevolence changed the strategic picture in a very specific and terrible way. The vessel itself was enormous, a dreadnought built to a scale the Republic had not encountered in its current military doctrine, moving through contested space with the particular quality of menace that belongs to things that know they are the most dangerous thing in the immediate vicinity. But what made the Malevolence more than an oversized warship was the weapon it carried. An ion cannon of unprecedented power, capable of disabling every electronic system on every ship within a significant radius with a single pulse. Shields, engines, weapons, life support, all of it gone simultaneously. Ships hit by the pulse didn't explode dramatically. They just stopped, went dark, drifted, and then the Malevolence's conventional weapons finished them at whatever pace the gunners chose. There were no survivors from the ships it struck, because the conditions after an ion pulse made survival essentially impossible before any rescue could arrive. General Grievous commanded the Malevolence. He was the Confederacy's primary field commander, answering directly to Dooku. Grievous was not a Sith and had no Force sensitivity in any measurable way. He was a Kaleesh warrior who had been systematically rebuilt into a cyborg following what he believed was a catastrophic accident, which was in fact a precisely engineered event designed by Dooku to create a commander who was both capable and deeply personally loyal to the one who had given him his second life in metal and artificial muscle. Most of Grievous's original organic body was gone. What remained was a mechanical frame built specifically for combat. Light enough to move with genuinely dangerous speed and strong enough to overpower most opponents physically. He carried 4 lightsabers taken from Jedi he had killed, collected, and displayed with the deliberate consciousness of someone who wanted people to know exactly what those trophies represented. He hated Jedi with an intensity that was personal rather than ideological, which made him more dangerous in individual encounters and occasionally less sound in larger strategic judgment. The Malevolence struck Republic medical convoys first. Unarmed ships carrying wounded clone troopers from frontline engagements back to treatment facilities. The targeting of medical ships was not a mistake or a secondary consequence of something else. It was deliberate. It was a message. The Republic cannot protect its most vulnerable. The psychological effect on clone morale and on the Senate and on Republic populations following the news was as deliberately calculated as any military objective. Master Plo Koon's fleet encountered the Malevolence in its early operations. His cruisers were hit with the ion pulse, left dead in space in the dark. Most of the survivors were destroyed before rescue could have reached them. Plo Koon himself survived in an escape pod with a small group of clone troopers, drifting in the debris field of his fleet, refusing to stop hoping, because that was what Plo Koon was. Ahsoka found him. She and Anakin had gone searching in direct defiance of orders to stand down, because Ahsoka knew Plo Koon and was not willing to accept that he was simply gone without looking. And Anakin was the kind of general who treated orders to stand down as open to interpretation when lives could be saved by reinterpreting them. They found the escape pod. They brought Plo Koon and his troopers out, and they carried back information about the Malevolence that the Republic needed to begin developing a response. The campaign to destroy the Malevolence required the kind of compounding improvisation that Anakin was built for. The first attack run used a squadron of Y-wing bombers, slow and vulnerable and necessary because they were the only available craft that could carry the ordnance needed to matter. The first assault cost lives and failed to destroy the ion cannon. Anakin found a second approach through a nebula formation in the region, a space environment that disrupted the cannon's targeting systems just enough to allow a closer approach. They damaged the cannon and destabilized it. The Malevolence was wounded. Then Padme arrived in a Naboo skiff that had been pulled from hyperspace by a luring device designed to draw Republic senators to their deaths. And suddenly, the strategic objective of killing a warship had to share space with the fact that Anakin was not going to accept Padme dying there under any strategic reasoning anyone could produce. He and Obi-Wan went aboard the Malevolence directly, fought through its corridors while the destabilized weapon continued building toward catastrophic failure, found Padme, and extracted. Grievous escaped in his personal fighter as the situation turned decisively against him. Because escaping was something Grievous was reliably good at, regardless of circumstances. The Malevolence's hyperdrive had been sabotaged, and it collided with a dead moon at the edge of the system when it attempted to jump anyway. The explosion was visible for millions of kilometers. One ship destroyed, but the Malevolence had annihilated an entire fleet before it was stopped, and Grievous was already moving toward the next operation. The war did not pause for anyone's victories. Music Ryloth had been suffering under occupation for long enough that the Republic's arrival felt to the people there more like a delayed obligation than a rescue. The Twi'lek homeworld had been taken by separatist forces under Wat Tambor, a methodical Skakoan who viewed occupied territory primarily as an economic resource and its inhabitants as variables to be managed accordingly. He stripped the planet's goods, confined the population, and deployed Twi'lek civilians as living shields against any Republic counterattack because the strategy worked. If the Republic wanted to retake Ryloth without killing the people it was coming to liberate, it had to solve that problem first. The cruelty was functional. The Republic campaign to retake Ryloth developed in 3 phases, and each phase illustrated something different about what the Clone Wars actually looked like from inside them. The first phase, the space campaign to break the blockade, was Ahsoka's first time commanding a full fighter group, and it went wrong quickly. She pressed an attack at the wrong moment, misread the tactical situation, lost most of her squadron in an engagement that better judgment would have withdrawn from sooner, and pulled back with losses that were painful to look at directly. The debrief with Anakin was honest in a way that a softer version would not have been. He told her what she had done wrong. He told her she needed to find a way to function past it rather than be consumed by it. He gave her another chance to command, because giving up on someone after one failure was not how Anakin Skywalker operated. The second engagement was different. Ahsoka used the wreckage of the ships she had lost in the first attack as cover for a flanking approach the blockade commander had not prepared for, because executing it required treating those destroyed ships as a tactical resource rather than a source of grief, which was a harder kind of thinking than it sounded. It worked. The blockade broke. The Republic had its path to the surface. Ahsoka did not celebrate. She understood what had been spent to get there. On the ground, Mace Windu worked alongside a Twi'lek resistance force led by a man named Cham Syndulla, whose relationship with the Republic was complicated in ways that were entirely understandable. Cham wanted his world free. He was also uncertain about whether Republic liberation meant freedom or meant trading, one occupying force for another, with different paperwork and better stated intentions. He had seen how Republic military presence tended to persist past the immediate crisis that justified it. He fought alongside Mace Windu because he had no better option, and because Mace Windu was, at minimum, someone who actually listened to what Cham was telling him about his own people and his own world, rather than explaining to him what his people needed and how they should feel about being helped. That quality was rarer than it should have been in Republic leadership during the war. The combination of Republic forces and Twi'lek resistance was effective and tense in the specific way of partnerships built on necessity rather than trust. The liberation of Ryloth's capital required navigating the civilian shield problem that Tambor had built into the situation. There was no clean military approach that didn't risk killing the very people the operation existed to protect. Obi-Wan found a different kind of solution. He made contact with a separatist officer who had his own private reservations about the methods being employed, and found a window, brief but real, for civilians to be moved from the most dangerous areas before the final assault began. It cost time and involved risks that pure military logic would have rejected. Obi-Wan's logic was not purely military. The civilians were moved. The capital was taken. Tambor's attempt to strip everything of value from the city during his retreat was stopped before he could finish. Ryloth was free, but freeing a world and healing a world are different things. The Republic committed to reconstruction and stretched already strained resources further to do it. Ryloth had been damaged in ways that weeks of liberation could not address. Cham Syndulla went back to the work of protecting his people with the particular weariness of someone who knows that the most visible part of the fight ending doesn't mean the fight itself is finished. The war continued. It always continued. Music. In the Senate, the war was a different kind of experience entirely. Padme Amidala sat in her chamber and watched the institution she had given her career to deform under the pressures of emergency. Emergency powers were supposed to be temporary. They always were, by formal definition. In practice, they created structures and precedents that proved remarkably resistant to reversal once they were established and accepted as the new normal. Chancellor Palpatine had been granted extraordinary authority at the beginning of the conflict, and he exercised it carefully and visibly in ways that seemed reasonable, given the scale of what the Republic was facing. He consulted the Senate on major decisions, or appeared to. He deferred to Jedi judgment on military strategy, or appeared to. He was consistently gracious, and he frequently reminded everyone around him that his authority was held in trust on behalf of the people they served. Padme watched this and felt something she couldn't quite identify precisely enough to articulate to anyone. Not suspicion with specific grounds. She had no concrete evidence of anything improper. Palpatine had been a mentor and a supportive presence in her political life since she was Queen of Naboo, had helped her navigate her first years in the Senate, had been genuinely encouraging in ways she had valued. But watching how the war was changing the Senate, watching how debate was shortening, and how opposition to certain measures was being characterized as disloyalty to the war effort, and how emergency frameworks were quietly becoming permanent ones, she felt the distance growing between what the Republic was supposed to be and what it was becoming under these particular pressures. She kept arguing for diplomatic alternatives. She kept building coalitions with senators who shared her discomfort. She was not naive enough to believe arguments alone could stop what she was watching. She was not willing to stop making them either. Bail Organa of Alderaan and Mon Mothma of Chandrila were her closest political allies in these conversations. They talked in quiet offices about what the war was doing to institutions that had taken millennia to build, about whether there were pathways toward negotiation that the military leadership wasn't pursuing, because military leadership, by its nature, doesn't pursue peace. While there is still a war it believes it can win. These conversations were careful. The political climate was shifting in ways that made caution about the conduct of the war sound, to some ears, like insufficient commitment to prosecuting it. Music. Anakin was in the field during most of this. He was almost always in the field. The war had given him something he had not known he was looking for. A context in which his particular combination of gifts was not excessive or difficult to accommodate, but exactly what the situation required. He was the most tactically effective general the Republic had. And everyone from Obi-Wan to the senior clone command to the Jedi Council understood this, even when his methods made them uncomfortable. He operated at a pace and intensity that would have destroyed most people. Rex could match it. Ahsoka was learning to, but Anakin was also carrying things. He had always been carrying things. His childhood, his mother, who had died in his arms after being freed from slavery too late, and whom he had avenged in a way the Jedi Code had nothing adequate to say about. The marriage he couldn't acknowledge. The fears he couldn't discuss with anyone except Padme, in the brief windows when they were in the same place. And increasingly, The relationship with Chancellor Palpatine that was giving him things he needed and things that were doing him harm simultaneously. In a combination he couldn't cleanly separate. Palpatine had maintained his personal mentorship of Anakin throughout the war. When Anakin was on Coruscant, they met regularly. They talked about the campaigns, about the politics, about the Jedi Order and what it meant to serve the Republic, and whether the Order's approach to its own members was as wise as it claimed to be. Palpatine never said anything overtly problematic. He asked questions and listened carefully to the answers, and occasionally offered observations that felt, to Anakin, like honest engagement rather than institutional management. The Council gave him assignments and evaluations. Palpatine gave him the feeling that someone was actually paying attention to who he was, rather than just what he could do. This was the hook. Though Anakin couldn't see its shape yet, Palpatine had been cultivating this relationship since Anakin arrived on Coruscant as a frightened and extraordinary boy. Every expression of confidence, every moment of warmth, every time Palpatine positioned himself as the adult who understood Anakin better than the Council did, was part of a much longer calculation. Not that the relationship was entirely fabricated. Palpatine was too sophisticated for simple performance. He genuinely found Anakin interesting, perhaps genuinely valued the relationship in some limited sense. But genuine interest and deliberate manipulation are not mutually exclusive in someone practiced enough to hold both simultaneously. Palpatine had been practicing for decades. The Jedi Council noticed some of the shape of this. They saw that Anakin's connection to the Chancellor was closer and more personal than appropriate. They raised it carefully, without being entirely direct about what specifically concerned them, because direct conversation about emotional attachment was something the Jedi framework was better at codifying than addressing. Anakin registered their unease without understanding its source and interpreted it as another expression of the fundamental distrust they had shown him since his arrival in the Order, the ongoing argument about whether he should have been trained at all. The Council and Anakin were trapped in a pattern where every attempt to address the real concern surfaced older ones that prevented resolution. Obi-Wan could see the shape of this from outside, and didn't know how to interrupt it without making things worse. He said some things. He didn't say enough. He carried that knowledge quietly forward. Mandalore was attempting very hard to stay out of all of this. The planet had a complicated history with violence. The Mandalorians had once been among the most feared warriors in the galaxy, a culture organized entirely around martial excellence and the willingness to go anywhere and fight anyone. Their history was written in the records of worlds they had raided and wars they had conducted, and the long aftermath of cycles of violence and retaliation that had cost them enormously across generations. The version of Mandalore that existed during the Clone Wars was something deliberately and thoughtfully different. Duchess Satine Kryze had come to power after witnessing what the old warrior culture had cost her people and had rebuilt Mandalorian society around a complete rejection of that history. New Mandalore was a world of domed cities and pacifist governance and strict official neutrality in any external conflict. It was an extraordinary thing to have built, and it required constant active maintenance against all the forces that wanted to see it undone. Not everyone on Mandalore had accepted what Satine had made of their world. The people who believed she had stripped their culture of its essential identity, that a Mandalorian civilization that did not fight was not really Mandalorian at all, formed an underground movement called Death Watch. They wanted the old Mandalore, the world that other species feared, the armor that meant something terrible to whoever recognized it. Deathwatch was willing to work with any outside power that could help them achieve restoration, which made them useful to separatist interests, and eventually drew them into currents much older and stranger than the Confederacy represented. Obi-Wan Kenobi had personal history with Satine Kryze that stretched back years before the war to a mission in his younger years, when he had been assigned to protect her during an earlier period of civil conflict on Mandalore. They had spent a year together, under conditions that produced the kind of closeness that proximity and shared danger and youth create when all three are present simultaneously. They had developed something between them that neither had found a clean way to resolve before duty separated them, and that had not simplified with the passage of time. She was one of the very few people in the galaxy who could genuinely unsettle Obi-Wan Kenobi's professional composure, not through confrontation but through a direct honesty about feeling that cut through all the careful deflection he had learned to rely on. He cared about her in ways that Jedi were not supposed to form. He had managed this by never addressing it directly. She cared about him in ways she was entirely unapologetic about. The asymmetry was its own particular kind of difficulty. The investigation into the threat to Mandalorian stability brought him back into her orbit. He worked with Satine while tracing the Deathwatch network and found the situation more layered than initial intelligence had suggested. The external threat was real. The separatist interest in destabilizing a strategically located neutral system was genuine. The internal divisions on Mandalore were genuine. Obi-Wan gathered what he could and reported back and extracted from Mandalore without addressing any of the personal dimensions of the visit. Because that was what Obi-Wan Kenobi did with personal dimensions. He catalogued them carefully and carried them forward without resolution. Satine fought for Mandalore's neutrality in the Senate directly, traveling to Coruscant at considerable personal risk, while Deathwatch and their external backers tried to manufacture a justification for Republic military intervention that would have ended the very thing she had spent her career building. She made her case with the force of someone who had spent years defending something that required constant defending and had become very good at that specific work. The vote went her way. Mandalore remained neutral. She went home to the exhausting and necessary work of maintaining a pacifist civilization surrounded by a galaxy consuming itself with war. Music, the dark currents running below the surface of the conflict, had their own momentum entirely separate from the main military campaigns. On Dathomir, a Night Sister named Mother Talzin ran an organization of Force-using women whose abilities drew from traditions ancient enough that the Jedi had only fragmentary records of them. The Night Sisters worked in ways distinct from both Sith and Jedi practice, rooted in their specific world and the specific history of their culture, rather than in the galactic traditions that had shaped either order. Mother Talzin was their matriarch and their most capable practitioner, and she was a figure whose influence extended into galactic affairs further than most people suspected. She had history with Dooku, the kind of history that becomes defined by mutual use and accumulated distrust over years of working together without ever actually trusting each other. When Dooku decided he needed a powerful new asset beyond what his current forces could provide, he came to Dathomir. He wanted something raw and devastating that could function in situations where droids couldn't, and where dark side assassins like Asajj Ventress had reached their limits. Talzin provided Savage Opress, a Zabrak warrior selected through a brutal elimination process, and then enhanced through Night Sister techniques until he could move through most opposition with the direct power of something built specifically to destroy. Dooku took him and trained him after a fashion, which meant breaking him down and attempting to reconstruct him as something more obedient. Because that was essentially what Dooku did with those placed under his instruction. Savage endured it with a private purpose. He had a brother somewhere in the galaxy. Talzin had given him that information, along with reasons enough to stay alive and functional until he could act on it. His brother was the reason behind everything Savage was willing to absorb from Dooku. His brother was Maul. Darth Maul had not died on Naboo. This was not information available to the Republic. It was not something the Jedi Council knew. It was not something anyone had announced, because the only being in the galaxy who knew it with certainty was Palpatine, who had very specific reasons for not advertising the continued existence of a former apprentice he had discarded and moved past when a better instrument became available. Maul had survived the fight in the Theed reactor room through the specific combination of rage and dark side power and pure animal survival instinct that had kept him holding on past the point where any rational analysis would have said holding on was finished. He had drifted through space in a state that was barely consciousness and landed on a debris world called Lotho Minor, where he had spent years in the depths of the refuse in a state that was barely functioning, his mind fractured by isolation and pain, and the dark side's particular cruelty toward those it has touched and abandoned. His lower body replaced by a mechanical construction, his damaged mind had assembled from whatever his surroundings provided. What Savage found when he finally located his brother was something broken in fundamental ways that were not all visible from the outside, but not extinguished. Underneath the madness was everything Palpatine had built into Maul since his earliest years. The hatred and the power and the identity that had been shaped by training so intensive and so early that it had become part of the structure of who Maul was beneath everything else that had happened to him. It would take Mother Talzin's particular abilities and Savage's presence and time to restore enough of Maul's mind and body to something functional. What emerged was not the silent and focused weapon Palpatine had deployed on Naboo. It was something angrier and less controlled, and in certain specific ways more genuinely dangerous. Because the discipline that had once contained Maul's considerable power was no longer fully intact, and rage with skill, but without complete discipline, produces outcomes that even the person generating them cannot always predict or control. Maul returned to the galaxy without announcing himself. He and Savage simply began moving through the outer rim, leaving evidence of their passage that those paying attention would eventually follow. Maul had been planning during his years in the dark, in whatever fractured capacity had remained available to him, and what he had arrived at was a goal entirely his own, separate from Palpatine's design and separate from the Sith hierarchy he had been constructed to serve. He had spent his whole life as someone else's weapon. Now, he was going to build something that was his. The galaxy would find out what that meant in the time that remained. Music. Mortis was not a place that could be found on any navigational chart. It existed in some relationship to ordinary space that standard instruments could not describe or reliably locate twice. An old Jedi distress code broadcasting from coordinates that should have contained nothing drew Anakin and Obi-Wan and Ahsoka to follow it. Because Jedi distress signals were not things the Order ignored, and because the Force had a way of arranging the things that needed to happen to feel like choices that had already been made before anyone consciously made them. What they found when they arrived was not a planet in any standard sense. It was a location that the Force was not merely present in but seemed to constitute, as though this particular corner of existence was made of the Force rather than simply permeated by it. The beings who lived in Mortis were the Father, the Son, and the daughter. These were not Force users of any category that experience provided language for. They were something beyond the categories entirely. Representations or embodiments of the Force's fundamental nature, of the balance between its aspects and of each aspect itself in something approaching its purest expression. The son was the dark side in personal form. The daughter was the light side in personal form. The father maintained the balance between them, which required constant effort, because that balance was not a natural equilibrium, but something that had to be actively sustained, or it would collapse toward whichever pull was stronger at any given moment. The father told Anakin that the prophecy was real, that the one destined to bring balance to the Force was not a story the Jedi told themselves, but a fact, and that Anakin was its subject. He wanted Anakin to stay in Mortis, to take his place maintaining the balance when the father was no longer able. The son wanted Anakin for different and darker reasons. Both of them showed him things. The son showed him specifically what he would become. Visions of the choices Anakin would eventually make, and the darkness he would inhabit, and what that darkness would cost, the galaxy and the people he loved most. Anakin saw it, clear and terrible. And then the father took those memories from him, before they could fully settle, because the father believed that the specific foreknowledge would break something in Anakin that needed to remain intact for what was coming. Whether different choices would have followed from retained memories is a question the story cannot answer. What can be said is that Mortis changed none of the fundamental pressures accumulating around Anakin. His fears were unchanged. His attachments were unchanged. Palpatine was unchanged, patient and attentive, and slowly building toward what he had been building toward for decades. A vision of the future, even held clearly, might not have been sufficient to overcome all of that. The Force gives warnings in forms that beings don't always know how to act on. They left Mortis with their lives, and with the experience already beginning to take on the quality of something that had happened at a remove, clear at the center and fading at the edges, the certainty of what had been shown, giving way to something less defined and less actionable. Music. Umbara was where the Clone Wars showed a particular face that many of the troopers who survived it would never fully recover from. Not because of what the enemy did to them, though the enemy on Umbara was formidable, because of what a Republic general did to his own men. Pong Krell was a Jedi Master, assigned to command the clone forces on Umbara after Anakin was recalled to Coruscant for separate reasons. Krell was large and technically capable, and held his soldiers in evident contempt. He issued tactical orders that were wasteful of clone lives in ways that moved past acceptable wartime loss into something that looked, from inside the formation, like indifference to whether the men following his instructions lived or died. Rex identified this and pushed back clearly and with appropriate documentation of his concerns, because Rex was the kind of soldier who understood that commanders could be wrong and that raising concerns through proper channels was part of his responsibility. He was overruled. Krell outranked him. The Jedi chain of command was supposed to be trusted. The clones followed the orders because they had been trained to follow orders and watched their brothers fall in engagements that better decisions would have made survivable. The truth about Krell explained everything and made all of it worse simultaneously. He had already committed himself to the separatist cause. He was deliberately feeding the enemy information and deliberately expending clone lives to damage the Republic's ability to prosecute the war, because he had concluded that the Confederacy was going to win and wanted to be positioned as a valuable defector when that winning happened. He was betraying the Republic from inside its own command structure, wearing the identity of a Jedi general while serving the people his soldiers were dying to fight against. When the clones discovered what he was, stopping him required something their training had not prepared them for, and that their deepest conditioning resisted. It required clone troopers to point weapons at a Jedi and follow through on the threat. Rex gave the order. The troopers who had survived Umbara under Krell's command followed it. Krell was captured. He was executed not through Republic military justice, but by a clone named Dogma, who had believed in Krell most completely and most stubbornly of all of them, who had defended him longest against the concerns others were raising, and who felt the betrayal, therefore, most personally. There was no version of Umbara that felt like a victory. The planet was taken. The objective was achieved. Every clone who came off that surface carried something that would not leave them. Umbara was the war, teaching the clones something they had not been designed to know: that the people above you in a chain of command could be wrong. Not tactically wrong, in ways that could be debated and adjusted, fundamentally wrong on purpose, in ways that made everything they were being asked to do a lie. Once known that knowledge could not be unfiled, it changed the specific quality of trust that the troopers extended from that point forward in ways that were quiet and significant and never fully resolved. Music. This was where things stood as the war moved through its middle years toward what would eventually become its final form. The Republic was winning individual engagements and losing the broader war of attrition that the Confederacy's manufacturing advantage made the real measure of success. The Jedi were serving as military commanders and being changed by the experience in ways that they couldn't fully acknowledge, because acknowledgement would have required a conversation about whether what they were being asked to do was compatible with what they were supposed to be. Anakin was accumulating darkness alongside his victories, each loss adding to something that was being very carefully tended by the most patient man in the Republic. Ahsoka was growing into someone extraordinary, carrying both her own gifts and what her master had given her, and had not yet encountered the test that would define her most completely. Out in the Outer Rim, Maul was building something. It would take time and require alliances with people who would have seemed like impossible partners. And when it was finished, it would be the kind of thing that changed what people understood the war to be. On Mandalore, Satine continued to hold the neutrality she had built, not yet knowing what was coming for her world. In the Senate, Padme kept arguing for peace in an institution, finding less space for that argument with each passing session. And underneath all of it, moving through his days with the practiced calm of someone who has already made every decision that matters and is simply waiting for the sequence of events he arranged to arrive at its predetermined conclusion, Palpatine was counting. The war would continue. There was still much ahead. Things that would break what seemed unbreakable. Choices that would define what everyone involved actually was underneath the roles the war had assigned them. A siege on a world that had already survived too much. A young Padawan who would be failed by the system that was supposed to protect her. And at the end of it, something none of them were ready for. Even the ones who thought they were. But that was still ahead. For now, the war continued, as it always did. As it would until it didn't. And what replaced it was worse than anything they had yet imagined. While the Republic was consumed by the war, it could see something else was being built in the dark. A war beneath the war. A plan nobody saw coming. And the man behind it was someone the galaxy had already decided was dead. His name was Maul, cut in half on Naboo, dropped into a reactor shaft, left behind on a garbage world at the edge of known space with a shattered mind and absolutely no intention of staying finished. He was not finished, and what he built next was arguably more dangerous than anything the Separatists had assembled. Not a Sith's plan, not a military campaign, something different entirely, because it was built on an understanding that armies and Jedi couldn't counter with lightsabers and gunships. Maul understood that the galaxy's criminal infrastructure was itself a form of power, vast and distributed and nearly impossible to uproot, and that whoever controlled it controlled something no Senate vote and no clone army could simply defeat in a field engagement and walk away from. The Shadow Collective was what Maul built. He started with Death Watch, which was the beginning of everything because Death Watch was already organized and already equipped and already burning with the specific motivation of people who believe their culture has been stolen from them. Pre Vizsla led Death Watch, a Mandalorian warrior of genuine ability who wore the Darksaber, the ancient black-bladed lightsaber that had once belonged to the first Mandalorian Jedi and that had become, over centuries, the symbol of Mandalorian leadership. The artifact whose possession meant something. Vizsla wanted Mandalore back. He wanted the warrior culture restored. He was willing to work with Maul to get there, with the private understanding that he would deal with Maul afterward, once Maul had served his purpose. Maul understood this completely. He was not naive about what Vizsla intended. He had spent years in the dark with a fractured mind, and come out the other side of that with a clearer understanding of betrayal and survival than most people could develop in a lifetime of normal experience. He allowed Vizsla to think the arrangement was equal because an equal arrangement was more useful to him at this stage than the alternative. The Death Watch fighters were necessary. Their Mandalorian expertise and their existing network on Mandalore were things Maul couldn't build quickly from nothing. So he used the partnership and kept his own timing in mind, with Death Watch established as the military arm of what he was building. Maul began reaching into the criminal underworld with a directness and a willingness to use violence that the various criminal organizations had not previously encountered from someone operating at his level. Black Sun was first. The Black Sun Crime Syndicate was one of the oldest criminal organizations in the galaxy, with roots stretching back centuries and operations across dozens of systems. Maul arrived at their facility on Mustafar with Savage and a willingness to demonstrate what happened to criminal organizations that declined to join what he was building. The leadership of Black Sun that didn't join was killed. The leadership that reconsidered and joined was absorbed. Black Sun's resources, its networks, its soldiers, all of it became part of the Shadow Collective. The Pike Syndicate came next. The Pikes controlled the spice trade through the Kessel Run and surrounding systems, which meant they controlled financial pipelines that ran through essentially everything the criminal economy touched. They were sophisticated enough to understand what was being offered and practical enough to accept it when the alternative was demonstrated clearly. The Hutt clans were harder. The Hutts had been operating their criminal empire for 1,000 years and did not respond well to the suggestion that they should subordinate themselves to anyone for any reason. Maul and Savage went to the Hutt Council personally and made their case in the most direct terms available. The Hutts joined. The Shadow Collective was now something that the criminal infrastructure of the entire Outer Rim was connected to and flowing through. What Maul had built was not just muscle. It was influence. It was the ability to disrupt trade routes and cut funding to separatist-aligned interests and undermine Republic supply chains and move information and contraband and people across borders that military forces couldn't easily cross. The Republic and the Confederacy were fighting a conventional war, while Maul had built something that operated in all the spaces that conventional war couldn't reach. He had not done this because he had forgiven the galaxy for what it had done to him. He had done it because building something real was the most complete form of revenge available to someone who had survived what he had survived. He wanted a kingdom. He wanted to matter in a way that no one could take from him by cutting him in half and dropping him down a shaft. The next step required Mandalore, and getting Mandalore required the plan working exactly as designed. Music. The plan was elegant in the specific way that plans are elegant when they treat people as pieces and move them accordingly. Maul and Vizsla arrived on Mandalore with their combined forces and orchestrated a crisis. They used their criminal network connections to stage a series of attacks on Mandalorian cities, creating the appearance of a crime wave that Satine's pacifist government was visibly failing to contain. Then Death Watch arrived as the solution, fighting off the attackers that they had arranged to be there, presenting themselves to the Mandalorian people as the warriors their world needed and their current leadership had refused to be. It was a performance. It was a performance that worked. The population that had supported Satine's new Mandalorian vision saw their cities burning and their government unable to stop it, and Death Watch appearing to protect them. The context in which Satine had built her pacifist movement depended on things remaining stable enough that peace looked like strength. When things stopped being stable, peace looked like weakness. That was the logic of the trap that had been built around her, and it closed exactly as designed. Maul's forces and Death Watch took Mandalore. Satine was captured. Her government fell. The warrior clans came back out into the open, and the Death Watch flag flew over the capital. And then Maul killed Pre Vizsla. He challenged him directly, in the traditional Mandalorian way, to single combat for leadership. Vizsla accepted because he was a Mandalorian warrior, and because the dark saber in his hand meant something, and because declining the challenge would have cost him everything he had just gained in the eyes of the people whose respect he needed. The fight was real and it was brutal, and Vizsla was genuinely capable. He was not capable enough. Maul took the darksaber from him. Maul killed him. And by Mandalorian tradition, the darksaber passed to its new owner, and Mandalore followed the darksaber. Maul was now the ruler of Mandalore. Not everyone accepted this. The Death Watch members who had followed Vizsla for reasons of personal loyalty rather than pure Mandalorian tradition refused to serve under a non-Mandalorian leader, regardless of what the old tradition said about combat and succession. They split off, taking Satine with them as a prisoner, hoping that her existence as a captive would give them leverage they could use. It gave them leverage for approximately as long as it took Maul to identify where they had taken her. Obi-Wan Kenobi came to Mandalore for Satine. He came without authorization from the Council, which was notable for a man whose relationship with the Jedi Code was generally more disciplined than his former Padawans. But Satine had sent a message before she was taken, and Obi-Wan had received it. And there was no version of the situation in which he was going to analyze it carefully and conclude that the appropriate response was to wait for Council approval. He went. He infiltrated the capital, found her, was captured with her almost immediately because Maul had been expecting someone to come. Maul had specifically been hoping it would be Obi-Wan. He wanted Obi-Wan to watch. Maul held Satine in front of Obi-Wan and used the darksaber and said things about balance and suffering and what it felt like to lose someone you loved. and he was specific about what he meant, because he had spent years on a garbage planet thinking about exactly this. He had thought about Obi-Wan specifically, about the lightsaber and the reactor shaft in the years that followed. This was not casual cruelty. This was something Maul had constructed carefully in the long dark. He wanted Obi-Wan to understand what surviving a loss like that felt like, because Maul had survived his, and this was the demonstration. Satine died in Obi-Wan's arms. She said what she needed to say to him before she was gone. He held her. Maul watched. He had achieved exactly what he came to achieve, and Obi-Wan's grief was exactly what he had designed it to be. What Maul had not fully calculated was that grief of that specific quality, arriving in a person of Obi-Wan Kenobi's particular composition, did not break him. It did not reduce him to the kind of rage that would make him easier to handle, or the kind of despair that would make him stop being a threat. It went somewhere inside him and became part of the foundation that everything else was built on, the way old damage always does in people who survive it. And Obi-Wan survived it the way he survived everything, by continuing to function, by doing the next thing that needed to be done. He escaped from Mandalore's prison with the help of Death Watch dissidents who had their own reasons to oppose Maul's rule, and he carried what had happened there with him in the way he carried all the things he didn't discuss, quietly, completely, for the rest of his life. Satine Kryze had built something extraordinary and had been killed because she built it. The pacifist civilization she had created survived her, though not in the form she would have recognized, and not for as long as the people who loved her would have wanted. But she had built it, and building it had been the choice of a person who understood exactly what it cost and made it anyway. That meant something. It still means something. Music. Palpatine came to Mandalore personally. That was the part that revealed something important about the shape of everything. The Sith Master, the secret architect of the war, the man who had been running the Republic from inside its own Senate for decades, traveled to Mandalore in person to deal with his former apprentice. This was not a decision made out of convenience or opportunity. Palpatine did not make decisions out of convenience. He made them out of precise calculation about what was necessary. And the calculation here was that Maul had built something that needed to be stopped before it became something Palpatine couldn't control. The Shadow Collective was real power, organized outside both the Republic and the Confederacy, operating in the criminal infrastructure of the Outer Rim. If Maul continued building it, it would eventually become a third force in the conflict, independent of anything Palpatine had designed. That could not be allowed. The plan had no room in it for a third force. He came with Dooku. They descended to the Mandalore capital and found Maul and Savage waiting for them, because Maul had known they would come eventually and had not been hiding from that knowledge. Maul had also not been naive enough to think the meeting was going to be a reconciliation. Savage died in the early moments of the confrontation, killed with a directness that made clear what the difference between Sith Masters of Palpatine's level and apprentices at Savage's level actually was. Maul fought on alone, with a desperation that Palpatine seemed to appreciate, in the way that someone who has been doing something for a very long time appreciates quality in what they are observing. Palpatine did not kill Maul. He could have. He chose not to. Maul was too useful alive, which was a calculation Maul himself understood. The moment it became clear that he was not going to be killed. To be kept alive by Palpatine was not mercy. It was a different kind of ending, one that involved being a resource rather than an independent force. used for whatever purpose required him, and contained when he was no longer needed. Maul understood this and could not stop it, because the gap between what he could do and what Palpatine could do had been demonstrated clearly enough to remove any remaining ambiguity. He was taken. The Shadow Collective without its center began to fragment. Mandalore without Maul's active governance descended into the kind of instability that power vacuums always produce. What Palpatine had done in coming to Mandalore was remind everyone watching that the war they could see was not the whole war, that there was a level of power moving through events that the visible participants, the Republic generals and the Separatist commanders and the Jedi Council and all the diplomats and senators arguing about the shape of the galaxy, none of them could fully perceive. He had been there the entire time, arranging, and he was not finished. Music. The Zygerian slave empire had been destroyed by the Jedi centuries before and had never fully accepted that destruction. The slave trade it had organized was one of the oldest industries in the galaxy, and the Zygerians who had run it carried the memory of their empire, the way conquered peoples always carry the memory of what was taken from them, with a resentment that time doesn't reduce so much as concentrate. When the Separatists offered them an alliance that included the restoration of their slave trade in exchange for loyalty and resources, the Zygerian Queen accepted without extensive deliberation. The Confederacy needed labor for its mining operations and manufacturing. The Zygerians had centuries of infrastructure built around acquiring and moving and controlling that kind of labor. The arrangement was functional. The Republic became aware of it when a Togruta colony, an entire population of Ahsoka's species, went missing. Anakin and Obi-Wan and Ahsoka and Rex were assigned to locate them and were captured in the process, which placed Anakin inside a slave operation and required him to function effectively while being confronted by something that hit the most fundamental layers of who he was. Anakin Skywalker had been a slave, not in the abstract, not as a historical fact he had processed and moved past, but as an experience that had shaped every year of his life before the Jedi found him and continued to shape years after. He understood what enslavement did to a person, not because he had studied it, but because it had been done to him, and the mechanisms of control, the specific degradations that kept a person unable to act on their own behalf. None of it was theoretical. Walking through a Zygerian slave facility, watching what was being done to people, required him to hold a particular kind of fury at a manageable level, while simultaneously executing a mission that required him to appear compliant and helpless when every instinct he had was pulling in the opposite direction. He managed it because Rex and Obi-Wan and Ahsoka needed him to manage it, and because the Togruta colonists needed him to manage it, and because he had learned long ago that the emotion could be used or it could use you, and the difference was whether you made the choice consciously. He made the choice. He found the colonists. He got them out. The mission succeeded in the specific way of missions that succeed at enormous personal cost to the people who execute them, and that leave marks not visible in any after-action report. The Zygerian campaign was one of the places where Anakin's history as a slave intersected most directly with the war he was fighting, and both Obi-Wan and Ahsoka saw what it cost him, and neither of them fully addressed it in any direct way afterward. Because that was the pattern the three of them had settled into for the things that were too large for ordinary conversation. They saw it. They filed it. They moved to the next engagement. Music on Onderon, a separatist-occupied world whose legitimate government had been replaced by a Confederacy-backed puppet regime. A rebel movement was forming that asked the Jedi for help they could not officially provide. The Jedi were agents of the Republic, and officially providing military training to rebel forces on a contested world would have been a political complication the Republic couldn't afford. But unofficially, in the way that important things sometimes get done when official channels are blocked, Anakin and Obi-Wan and Ahsoka went to Onderon and trained the rebels anyway. The leader of the rebel cell was a man named Saw Gerrera. He was young and passionate and entirely convinced that the situation called for more direct action than his fellow leaders were prepared to take. He was not wrong about the situation, though he was sometimes wrong about what the direct action should be and how much of it was appropriate. Ahsoka worked with him closely and recognized something in his intensity that she understood from her own experience, the way that caring about an outcome too much can push someone toward methods they would otherwise reject. She told him what she thought about that. He listened, partly. The rebel campaign on Onderon succeeded. The separatist-backed government was overthrown. The legitimate king was restored. The Republic did not officially acknowledge any of this, because officially none of them had been there. Saw Gerrera would carry the experience forward into a life that would increasingly be defined by the question of how far was too far, a question whose answer changed every time he faced a new variation of what he had faced on Onderon. The seeds of something that would eventually become the rebellion against the Empire were present in that campaign, though no one involved could have seen the shape of what they were planting. Music, the bombing of the Jedi Temple hangar on Coruscant, was what changed everything for Ahsoka. Not the war, not Umbara, not anything she had faced in the field where the moral coordinates were difficult but at least legible. The bombing was different because it came from inside the institution she belonged to and pointed toward consequences that the institution was not capable of examining honestly. The blast killed a number of people, including Jedi and Republic personnel working in the hangar. The investigation that followed moved quickly and in a direction that was, in retrospect, moving too quickly. Evidence accumulated against a suspect. The suspect was a young woman named Letta Termund, who had connections to a pacifist group and whose husband had worked in the temple. She was arrested and held for interrogation. Then she died in her holding cell under circumstances that pointed unmistakably toward force involvement, which meant the person who had killed her to prevent her from talking was a force user. The only force user known to have had contact with her recently was Ahsoka. Ahsoka was arrested. She escaped from custody, which did not help the case for her innocence in the eyes of people who were already moving toward a conclusion. She ran through the lower levels of Coruscant, trying to find the actual evidence that would prove what she knew, that she had not done any of this and that someone else had, and that the investigation was following a trail that had been laid deliberately to lead where it was leading. She found pieces of evidence. She found Asajj Ventress, of all people, who had reasons of her own to help, and reasons of her own to be cautious about helping, and who helped anyway, because the situation had a clarity that cut through the complications. The evidence pointed eventually to someone inside the Jedi Order itself. An old friend of Ahsoka's from her Padawan years, a young Jedi named Barriss Offee, who had concluded during the war that the Jedi Order had become something corrupt and militaristic and wrong at its foundation, and had decided that demonstrating this through violence was the appropriate response to that conclusion. Barriss believed, sincerely and with evidence that was not entirely inaccurate, that the Jedi had compromised what they were supposed to be by fighting the war the way they were fighting it. She was not entirely wrong about the diagnosis. She was catastrophically wrong about the treatment, but Ahsoka found all of this out too late. Or rather, she found it out at a moment when the Jedi Council and the Republic Senate had already decided to put her on trial. The charges were terrorism and murder and conspiring with the separatist enemy. The trial was in front of the Senate, which meant it was public and political. In addition to being judicial, Tarkin prosecuted, Padme defended. Anakin was not present for most of it, because Anakin was the one who went looking for the actual perpetrator, while everyone else was conducting the trial. He found Barriss. He heard her confession. He brought it back. The charges against Ahsoka were dropped. The trial ended. The council, having put her through everything they had put her through, offered her something that was supposed to be significant. They offered her knighthood. They told her that the trial had been a test, that her ability to maintain her principles under that kind of pressure was proof of exceptional character, that she had in fact proven herself through the ordeal. They offered her place back in the Order and a promotion within it. Ahsoka walked away. She stood in front of the council members who had handed her over to a Senate tribunal without defending her, who had removed her from the Order as a precondition of the trial, who had treated the accusation as sufficient to act on before the evidence was in. And she told them she was leaving, quietly, without anger that she expressed to their faces, though the anger was there, without the kind of dramatic confrontation that the moment might have invited. She just left. She walked down the steps of the temple and into the lower city and did not come back. Anakin followed her to the steps. He tried. He was the one person in the entire situation who had not needed to be convinced of her innocence, who had gone to find the truth while everyone else was managing the process. He stood there and tried to find the words that would make her stay. And he didn't find them, because the words didn't exist that could adequately address what had been done to her. She wasn't leaving because of him. She was leaving because of what the Order had shown her it was, in the moment that it mattered most. And she wasn't wrong about what it had shown her. He knew that. And not being able to argue against it was its own kind of pain. He watched her walk away and went back inside the temple, and did not know how to be what he was without her in it. Music. What Ahsoka's departure did to Anakin was not something he discussed with anyone. He had lost people before. He understood the specific shape of loss. But this was different from losing someone to violence or to distance or to the ordinary drift that separated people over time. This was losing someone to a failure of the institution he belonged to, a failure he had witnessed up close and been unable to prevent. And the failure had not been acknowledged or examined by the people responsible for it. The council had offered Ahsoka knighthood. They had not said they were wrong. They had not said they were sorry. They had framed the entire thing as an opportunity she had risen to, which was a way of refusing to look directly at what had actually happened. Anakin filed this alongside all the other things he was filing. The pattern was accumulating even if he couldn't see its full shape. Every time the council failed to be what it claimed to be. Every time the institutions he was fighting for showed him the gap between what they said they were and what they actually did when things got difficult. Every time someone he cared about was damaged by systems that were supposed to protect them. He filed it all and continued functioning and continued being the best general the Republic had, and did not process any of it in any sustained way, because there was always another engagement, and because Palpatine was always there with warm attention and the right questions and the quality of presence that made the lack of it from everyone else feel sharper by contrast. The war continued in its middle form for a while longer. The Bad Batch were a group of clone troopers from a unit that had come out of the Kaminoan cloning process with mutations that made them individually and collectively strange. Hunter, whose senses were enhanced beyond normal human range. Wrecker, whose physical strength exceeded what standard clone physiology produced. Tech, whose analytical capabilities were extraordinary, even by clone standards. Crosshair, whose marksmanship was essentially without equal among living shooters. Echo, who had been captured and partially converted by separatist technology, and whose integration back into a unit required everyone involved to expand what they meant by normal. They were misfit soldiers in a war that ran on standardization, and they were remarkably effective in the spaces where standardization failed. Anakin worked with Clone Force 99 on a mission that required exactly their particular combination of abilities, and found in them something he recognized from his own experience: people who didn't fit the expected form of what they were supposed to be, and had developed capabilities that the expected form couldn't have produced. They were effective in ways that regulation couldn't have generated. They were also, each of them, a person in a context that tried to reduce them to a function. And Anakin noticed this and treated them accordingly, which was a quality that made working with him different from working with most of the Jedi generals they encountered. The Separatist leadership made an error in the war's later stages that changed what the end of the conflict would look like. They kidnapped Chancellor Palpatine. They took him to a Separatist cruiser over Coruscant in what was meant to be either a decisive bargaining chip or the opening of a new phase of operations that brought the war to the core directly. Anakin and Obi-Wan were sent to get him back. They boarded the Invisible Hand, fought through its corridors, confronted Count Dooku in a duel that ended with Dooku's death at Anakin's hands. Palpatine encouraged it. He told Anakin to kill Dooku when Dooku was disarmed and defeated on the floor in front of them. Anakin did it, and knew immediately that he had done something that had nothing to do with the Jedi Code's relationship to surrendered opponents. He filed it with everything else he was filing. Grievous escaped again, because that was what Grievous did. He fled to Utapau, a sinkhole world in the Outer Rim, where the Separatist leadership was gathering. Obi-Wan was sent to find him. Anakin was not sent with him, which Obi-Wan noticed and understood without saying so directly. The Council was beginning to use Anakin in a different way, less as a battlefield commander and more as an asset in the political intelligence surrounding Palpatine, and that shift had its own complications that neither Obi-Wan nor Anakin could address directly yet. Music. The war was ending. Not in the way that wars end when one side loses and accepts it, but in the specific way of wars that have been orchestrated, where the ending is a stage in something larger and the people inside it can't see the larger shape. The Separatist military machine was enormous, and its production capacity was still formidable. But the core leadership was scattered, and the coordination that had made the early Confederacy campaigns so effective was degrading. Systems that had joined the movement for genuine political reasons were beginning to calculate whether the original grievances were worth what continuing to fight for them was costing. The kind of war that sustains itself on conviction becomes a different kind of war when conviction starts running out. Ahsoka was out in the galaxy somewhere, not in communication with the order that had failed her, building a life in the space between the Republic and the Separatist conflict, where people who didn't fit either category tried to survive. She was not done, though she didn't know yet what she was not done with. The Force doesn't let people with that kind of connection to it simply stop, even when they try, even when they have excellent reasons to try. Rex was still fighting, he was always still fighting. The 501st, under Anakin's command, had become one of the most effective and also most distinctive units in the Grand Army, shaped by years of operating under a general who treated the people he commanded as people, and by a captain who had built something in the space between military structure and genuine brotherhood. The troopers of the 501st called themselves Torrent Company sometimes and by other names at other times, but what they actually were was a group of people who had been through too much together to be accurately described by any organizational terminology. They had fought on too many worlds and buried too many brothers and continued anyway because that was what there was to do. What none of them knew was that underneath their skull plates, embedded by Kaminoan engineers as a standard feature of their creation, were inhibitor chips, small devices keyed to a specific signal, capable, when activated, of overriding whatever the clone had built of himself over years of experience and choice, and replacing it with a directive so fundamental it operated below conscious decision-making. The chips had been there since Kamino, since before any of them had ever been deployed. They had been there since before the war began, waiting for the signal that would tell them what they had always, at the most basic level of their creation, been built to do. The Kaminoans had built them in at the request of whoever had commissioned the army. And the person who had commissioned the army, under the borrowed name of a dead Jedi, was Darth Sidious, Palpatine. The chips were always part of the plan. The clones had never been built solely to fight the Separatists. They had been built to end the Jedi Order when the moment came. Music. The Siege of Mandalore was the last major campaign of the Clone Wars, and it happened simultaneously with the events on Coruscant that would end the war in a different and final way. Maul had escaped from Palpatine's custody. He had returned to Mandalore, because Mandalore was the thing he had built, and he was not willing to simply leave it. He had rebuilt some fragment of the Shadow Collective's influence there, not the full structure of what he had constructed before, but enough to have a position and enough to understand that whatever was coming next was going to be catastrophic in ways that even he, who knew Palpatine better than almost anyone alive, could only partially perceive. Ahsoka Tano came back. She had made contact with Bo-Katan Kryze, one of Satine's sister and a Death Watch veteran who had opposed Maul's takeover of Mandalore and who was attempting to retake the world for the Mandalorian people rather than for any outside power. Bo-Katan came to the Republic with a request. Help take Mandalore back. Help capture Maul, whose existence was something that the Republic, and more specifically the Jedi, needed to know about given what he represented and what he knew. She had one condition. She wanted Ahsoka Tano to lead the operation. Not a Jedi Master, not someone from the Council, Ahsoka specifically. Bo-Katan had seen what Ahsoka was, and had decided that what Ahsoka was someone she could work with. The Republic agreed to the request. Anakin was told about Ahsoka's involvement and went to find her before the operation launched, and their reunion was the kind of reunion between people who had been through too much to pretend that what had happened between them hadn't happened, but who needed to set it aside because there was a war still going, and what came next was going to require both of them to be exactly who they were. He gave her something before she left. His own lightsabers, recrystallized. She had been using a pair of white blades she had built since leaving the Order, rejecting the blue and green of the Jedi she was no longer part of. He gave her his, and she recrystallized them blue, and they talked about what they couldn't quite say to each other directly. And then she left to command the Siege of Mandalore with half the 501st Legion and Rex at her side. The siege was what it needed to be. Mandalorian cities are built for defense, and the Mandalorian fighters loyal to Maul were not going to make it easy, and Ahsoka led the operation with the particular combination of strategic intelligence and personal risk tolerance that she had learned from years fighting next to Anakin Skywalker. She moved through the campaign with Rex as her partner in everything that mattered, the two of them operating with the efficiency of people who have been in enough impossible situations together to stop being surprised by what they find in the next one. Maul was the objective, capturing him alive, bringing him back for the Jedi Council to interrogate. Because what Maul knew about Darth Sidious, about the Sith Master operating inside the Republic's own government, was information that could change the entire shape of the war. Maul knew things that no one else, outside of Palpatine's immediate circle, knew. He had been trained by Palpatine. He had been inside the design in ways that could illuminate it from the inside if someone could get him to talk. Ahsoka found him in the lower city. The fight between them was extraordinary. Two warriors who had each been shaped by years of the most demanding possible experience, moving through the ruins of a Mandalorian street with the particular intensity of people who understand that what they are doing matters beyond its immediate physical outcome. Ahsoka fought without a lightsaber's usual relationship to the Jedi Code she no longer formally belonged to. She fought with everything she had learned and everything she had survived, and she was enough. She captured him. She put him in a containment vessel for transport back to Coruscant. The siege was essentially won. Mandalore would be returned to the Mandalorian people. Rex and the 501st were consolidating their positions across the capital. The transport rose from the surface carrying Ahsoka and Rex, and the captured Maul and the clone troopers who had fought alongside her through the whole campaign. And everything seemed to be moving toward a conclusion. Then the signal came. Music, Order 66. It arrived in the inhibitor chips of every clone in the Grand Army simultaneously. A signal transmitted by Darth Sidious from Coruscant, where Anakin Skywalker had just knelt before a Sith Lord and accepted a new name and a new purpose, and sealed the fate of everything that had been building for the entire length of the war. The order was simple. The Jedi were enemies of the Republic. The clones were to eliminate them. Not some of them, all of them. Every Jedi in every theater of every campaign, shot by their own soldiers in the same moment, caught off guard because they had spent 3 years fighting alongside these men and trusting them and building something with them and never knowing what was underneath. On Utapau, Obi-Wan fell into a sinkhole lake and survived by luck and instinct, and the fact that he had been in enough impossible situations to have some residual ability to survive, even the ones he didn't see coming. He lay in the water in the dark and listened to the battle above him end in a different way than battles usually ended, and understood what had happened in the particular way that someone understands something they have no framework for, which is slowly and with a growing horror that replaces the initial inability to process. On a dozen worlds, Jedi Masters, who had been generals, fell to their own troops. Kit Fisto, Aayla Secura, Plo Koon, who had survived the Malevolence and countless other engagements, who had been flying patrols over Cato Neimoidia when the signal came. Ki-Adi-Mundi, Stas Ali, all of them taken by surprise by the people who had fought alongside them. All of them dead within minutes of the signal. The clone troopers who had built genuine bonds with their Jedi generals over 3 years executed those generals when the chips told them to because the chips operated at a level below what 3 years of genuine human connection could reach. On the Mandalore transport, Rex heard the signal. What happened next was the thing that made Rex different from most of what Order 66 produced. He turned toward Ahsoka, and she saw it in him. The shift. The moment when the Rex, who was her friend and partner, was being pushed somewhere by something that was not Rex at all. And she ran. She didn't fight him immediately because it was Rex. And she could see that what was happening to him was happening to him, not being chosen by him, and that distinction mattered even in the middle of a crisis that was trying to kill her. She survived the initial minutes through the Force, and through the fact that she was Ahsoka Tano, and surviving impossible things was something she had been practicing for years. She fought her way through clones she had just fought beside, clones who knew her and had trusted her and were now trying to kill her because something had been done to them that they didn't know about and couldn't resist. She reached Rex. She held him. She used the Force to remove his inhibitor chip, performing the operation with a precision and a desperation that the circumstances should not have allowed, and that she managed anyway, because there was no alternative she was willing to accept. Rex came back. He looked at her, and he was himself again, or as much of himself as someone who has just tried to kill someone they care about can be in the immediate aftermath of that. He took off his helmet, and he was Rex, and she was Ahsoka, and the ship was in chaos around them. And Maul had escaped his containment because Maul was always going to escape containment when the moment was sufficiently chaotic, and the two of them had to survive the next few minutes together. They fought their way to the hangar. They flew out in what was available. The transport went down, the clones still following their programming even without officers directing them, doing what they had been built to do. Ahsoka and Rex crashed on a moon somewhere and climbed out of the wreckage into a landscape that was very quiet, and they were alive. She buried the clones who had died in the crash. She buried them using her lightsabers as grave markers, pushing them into the moon's soil at the edge of the site. The blue blades Anakin had given her, marking the graves of the men who had tried to kill her under orders they hadn't chosen to follow. She left them there because she didn't know what else to do with them. She walked away from the site with Rex, and they did not know yet what the galaxy had become while they were surviving, only that it had become something new, and that whatever came next was going to have to be faced with exactly what they had: music. The Clone Wars ended not with a battle or a negotiation, but with a signal. 3 years of organized violence that had cost billions of lives across thousands of worlds, that had broken or damaged almost every institution the Republic possessed, that had used and discarded the clone soldiers who fought it, and the Jedi generals who led it, and the civilians who survived its passage through their worlds. And it ended because the man who had designed it from the beginning decided that it had achieved its purpose. Palpatine stood in the Senate and declared the Republic dead and the Empire born. And the senators who had been voting for emergency powers and military appropriations for 3 years stood up and applauded because they had been led step by step to exactly this moment and couldn't see clearly what each step had been for until the steps were done. Padme Amidala sat in her seat and watched and said the words that the moment produced in anyone paying honest attention. She said that this was how liberty died, with thunderous applause. She said it quietly to herself, in the chamber where she had spent years arguing for the things that were now finished. Anakin was gone. Not dead. Not yet. He had become something else, something that had been being built towards since he was a 9-year-old boy on Tatooine, who was told he might bring balance to the Force, and who had spent 20 years being shaped by forces working in opposite directions with equal and terrible efficiency. Darth Vader had not been created in the moment he knelt before Palpatine. He had been created across years of accumulated loss and suppressed grief and fear and manipulation, and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being too powerful to feel safe in ordinary connection and too attached to function at the detached figure the Jedi Code demanded. The Empire built its primary enforcer from what the war had left of Anakin Skywalker. The Jedi Order that survived was a remnant. Yoda and Obi-Wan, who had both survived Order 66 through what looked like luck, and was also the Force, still having purposes for them that weren't finished. A handful of others who had been away from their troops when the signal came, or who had survived long enough to run. They scattered. The temple on Coruscant burned. The archives that had held 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge were raided for what was useful and left to burn for the rest. The order that had kept the peace for a millennium was functionally gone in a single night. The clones kept marching. They kept following orders, now from an emperor, rather than a senate and a council. And they kept being effective because their training did not change when the command structure above them did. Most of them had no idea what had been done to them. The chips had activated and then stopped, and they had kept being soldiers under a new flag because being soldiers was what they knew how to be. Some of them, the ones who had been closest to their Jedi generals, carried something they couldn't name in the years that followed. A heaviness in certain memories. A difficulty looking directly at specific things. Rex would spend those years in hiding, eventually living outside the Empire, with the awareness of what had been inside his head the whole time and what it had made him do. Ahsoka walked away from the crash site on that unnamed moon and did not know where she was going. She had been a Jedi Padawan, and then not a Jedi, and then a commander of a military operation. And now she was on a moon with Rex, and the war was over in the worst possible way. And the order that had failed her had been destroyed, and the master she had loved was something she couldn't yet know the full shape of. She would find out eventually. She would keep surviving, and the galaxy would keep having needs that she was specifically equipped to meet. And she would meet them because that was what she was, regardless of what title she held or what organization she belonged to. What the Clone Wars had built was an empire that hadn't declared itself yet, and the rubble of everything that had stood before it, and a handful of people scattered across the galaxy who were still alive and who carried what they had lived through in the particular way of people who survived something that killed almost everyone around them, which is with a combination of grief for the ones who didn't make it, and a responsibility to the fact of having survived that they couldn't entirely explain or put down. The war had been fought by people who believed in what they were fighting for. The Republic, the Jedi Code, the lives of the brothers beside them, the idea that the galaxy could be a place where people were protected rather than used. These were not small things to believe in. They were not naive things, whatever the outcome suggested. The people who had believed them had given years of their lives, and many had given all of it. And what they had fought for had been real, even if what they had been fighting within had been a design pointed at its own destruction. The troopers who had marched in white armor across 100 worlds, and who had named themselves and decorated their helmets and built bonds with each other and with the Jedi who led them, they had been real. Every single one of them. The number was incomprehensible, and each one was specific, a person who had made particular choices within the narrow space that had been given them, and who had made those choices as well as anyone could make choices under those conditions. They deserved better than what they had been created to do, and what they were used for, and how they were discarded when the use was finished. That is one of the true things the Clone Wars left behind. The galaxy that came out the other side was smaller and darker, and ruled by fear in ways it had not been when the war began. The freedoms that had been eroded piece by piece during 3 years of emergency were not restored. The powers that had been granted temporarily were not returned. The institutions that had bent and cracked under the pressure of the war were not rebuilt. What replaced them was simpler and crueler and more efficient at the specific task of keeping people afraid enough to stay in place, which was the task the Empire was built for. But people were still alive. Ahsoka was still alive. Rex was still alive. Bail Organa went back to Alderaan carrying the knowledge of everything that had happened, and the twin children of Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala, one of whom he would raise as his own daughter, and both of whom the Force had not finished with yet. The seeds of what would eventually grow into something capable of challenging the Empire were already planted in the people who had survived the war and who carried what they had seen and what they had lost and what they had refused to stop believing in, despite all the evidence that believing in it was expensive. This is what the Clone Wars were. Not just battles and campaigns and the names of generals and the numbers of casualties, though those things were real, and the scale of them was staggering. They were 3 years in the life of a galaxy that thought it was fighting to protect itself and was being used to dismantle itself. And the people inside them who managed to stay human through the experience, who refused to stop caring about the specific person beside them, even when the larger picture was making caring about specific people look like a luxury. Those people are the part of the story that the history books couldn't fully capture. The war is over. The lights went out across the galaxy all at once. And somewhere in the dark that followed, the things that the war had tried to kill were still alive, waiting for the moment when the dark would be ready to end. They always are.